right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome everybody to tonight's episode for our Phillips Manor Hall lecture series. It is called The Armchair Time Traveler's Guide to Colonial Manhattan. My name is Michael Lord. I am the Historic Site Director here at Phillips Manor Hall in Yonkers. We are a New York State historic site located in the former Yonkers residence of the Phillips family. A building that dates back to the 1680s or thereabouts. Through our new permanent exhibit and website, we tell interactive and inclusive stories of the indigenous Munsee Lenape and the enslaved communities of African descent, and how these groups, through various issues and events and individuals and such, interacted with European colonists, such as the Phillips family, in the New York colonial era. I want to make sure that everything is working out okay here on our technical side. So far, so good, I believe. Groovy. All right. For today's virtual tour of Lower Manhattan, we will be wandering through the historic streets of Lower Manhattan, standing, virtually anyway, in a variety of locations that kind of change the course of humankind. Even though that might be a little over the top, we will be actually exploring some very interesting and noteworthy issues, events, and individuals. And if we're lucky, some of this might even surprise us a little bit. And we all get to do this from the comfort of our very own time-traveling armchair, or love seat, or, I don't know, should I even say it, futon, right? We've got a lot of ground to cover, but I hope to get to some questions at the end of this chat. So if you do have questions, please feel free to use the chat box. I'm kind of running solo here, so be happy to answer those questions at the end of the presentation, but type them in as you got them. That way you won't forget anything at that point. All right, so let's start with modern Manhattan. This is what we're familiar with. Skyscrapers, traffic jams, the hustle and bustle of people getting from here to there. I mean, this is Gotham, right? But it wasn't always like this. In fact, just 100 years ago, 1923, 1924, this was the tallest building in New York City. You know what it is, right? The Woolworth Building on Broadway, across the street from City Hall Park. And 200 years ago, this was the tallest building in 1823-24. That's the Trinity Church spire. Now, that's the second version of the church spire, not what we see today at Trinity Church, but it's on the same location, just a little farther down on Broadway, across from Wall Street. 300 years ago, 1723, I'm not even going to try to figure out what the tallest building was then, but we do know that Manhattan consisted actually of three separate towns, small ones, New York, Greenwich, and Harlem. And of the three, New York City was the largest, with a population of about 7,250. Now, that makes it third in size behind Boston and Philadelphia at the time. And that population of 7,250, well, if you look at today, that corresponds to about the size of Emerson, New Jersey, the 313th largest city in New Jersey today. So we're not talking about a very big town, not at this point. If we go back another century, about to the year 1600 or so, 424 years ago, this is what the island looked like. This is what it looked like to the original inhabitants of this area, the Munsee Lenape. Their land stretched from central New Jersey through northeastern Pennsylvania and all the way up through the mid-Hudson. The Munsee Lenape didn't use Lower Manhattan as a permanent settlement. Rather, this area was kind of used seasonally for fishing and for oystering. And as you can see, Manhattan was full of forests and hills and streams and swamps and ponds. Manhattan Island was also, at least in terms of its area, much smaller than Manhattan is today. Centuries of landfill has almost tripled the size of Lower Manhattan, as you can see from this sort of overlay image of old Manhattan and then all of that landfill kind of lightly shaded around it. For the 200 years or so that we're going to be covering in this talk, Manhattan had very little landfill. Only the east side was widened just a little bit, moving the shoreline from Pearl Street today out to Water Street. Now, okay, let me see what I'm doing here. I thought I was sharing my screen. I'm sorry, folks. Oh my goodness. Thank you, John. I appreciate that. I actually do have some backup today. That's very nice. All right, here's Manhattan Island, Old Manhattan. And here's sort of the overlay of sort of New Manhattan all around it. All of that? Sure. Sure, audience. I appreciate that too. All right. Here we're going back to 1923 or 24 with the Woolworth Building being the tallest building a century ago. And this is sort of an overview of Lower Manhattan at that time as well. Moving back another century to about 1824, this is the Trinity Church spire, the second one. The current one is even taller than this, but this was the tallest building in 1723. Going back a little earlier, we now have Manhattan Island showing three towns. New York City at the left end, Greenwich kind of at the top middle, and Harlem way over there on the right-hand side. Three separate towns separated by all sorts of forests and hillsides and things such as that. This is what Manhattan looked like to the Munsee Lenape before any Europeans came here. It was forests, it was lowlands, there were hillsides, much different than today. This is the overlay that we're seeing slightly. So there's a whole lot of Manhattan that wasn't there in the 16 and 1700s. There was no Battery Park. There was no Freedom Tower, no West Side Highway, no East Side Highway, no Brooklyn Bridge, all of that. Lower Manhattan was settled by the Dutch in the 1620s. It was known as New Amsterdam. And if you've ever driven through Lower Manhattan, there is no street grid like the rest of the borough. Down here, everything arcs and bends, conforming to long-lost streams, hillsides, Munsee Lenape trails, and the narrowing of the island's original shape. This Google Street Map of Lower Manhattan is inset or inlaid with a map known as the Costello Plan, which was originally made in 1660. You can see how today's streets still correspond to those laid out more than 360 years ago. And although it's easy to get lost driving or even walking down these narrow streets of Lower New York City has never abandoned that original street layout of New Amsterdam. In fact, 40 years ago, Lower Manhattan street layout was granted landmark status. Now, why the buildings have changed, Manhattan is now a lot taller, it's a lot wider than it used to be. We still follow the street pattern originally laid out in the 1640s and the 1650s by the Dutch. Now, predating Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam, the first non-indigenous settler to this region was a man named Jan Rodriguez. See, in the spring of 1613, a Dutch explorer had sailed his ship, the Jong Tobias, along the west side of Manhattan, and the captain left one of his sailors, Jan Rodriguez, on the island with enough equipment for him to settle, to hunt, to defend himself and such. And although Rodriguez was described as a black rascal by his captain, he dealt peacefully with the local Munsee Lenape, learning their language, serving as maybe an interpreter for other Dutch ships entering the harbor. Eventually, Rodriguez, a man of African and Portuguese descent, was born in Santo Domingo, in fact. He settles the island, and that year, 1613, is pretty important because that was 11 years before New Netherlands was sort of officially established. It was 7 years before the Mayflower landed at Plymouth, and a full 6 years before the first, so-called first, Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. Rodriguez was the first non-indigenous inhabitant of Manhattan and of New York. So let's take a look at Lower Manhattan and see what we find. Now, we're all familiar with this skyline view. And like this picture, some of the earliest images of New Amsterdam were also sketched, say, from the harbor. And it makes sense if you're arriving on board a ship to this place. So this is the skyline from the 1650s, when New Amsterdam was little more than a ragtag frontier village. The building way in the background is Fort Amsterdam. I've got a slightly more cleaned up version of the New Amsterdam skyline to make the fort a little bit easier to see. It helps to add a circle around it as well. Pretty impressive, right? But after the British took control, Fort Amsterdam remained. It was just renamed. It was then called Fort James and eventually Fort George. They basically rename the fort every time there's a new king. Before all the landfill, the fort stood at the waterfront. It was built to protect the small town from enemy ships entering into the harbor. Inside the fort's walls were barracks for soldiers. There was a chapel, a residence for the Director General, later New York's Lieutenant Governor. And as small as it seems, the fort stood until 1790 and was pretty much the largest building in Manhattan for most of its existence. Today, on the site of that fort, is the Museum of the Native American, also known as the Alexander Hamilton Customs House. This Beaux Arts landmark, with sculptures in the front by Daniel Chester French, was completed in 1907, and the building takes up pretty much the entire footprint of the old fort. Now, I'm going to use this map of New Amsterdam to move us around Old Manhattan for a while. It's known, as I had said before, as the Costello Plan, but it was actually drawn by a cartographer named Jacques Cortelyou in 1660. It's very detailed, showing the houses and the numerous kitchen gardens that made up the village of New Amsterdam. And it's also oriented sideways just to confuse us. So the southern tip of Manhattan is actually on the left side. The Hudson River, the North River as they called it, is on the top side of this map. And here's the fort. It's pretty easy to see at this point that it is the largest thing in New Amsterdam at that point in comparison to the rest of the city. This dwarfs everything else there. Now, moving out from the old fort, we're going to walk across the street. Broadway begins at the wide opening in the front side of the fort, which is on the right side there. The bottom side of that fort has a smaller open space around it and was used for grazing. It was used as grazing pasture, basically, for the sheep and the hogs that kind of ran open throughout the town. It was known as the Markveld. Today, that would be Whitehall Street. Now, looking across the street from the Markveld, we see a series of houses, homes, and such. This one, at the corner of Brower Street, belonged to Frederick Phillips. Now, because I work at Phillips Manor Hall, I'm obligated to talk a little bit about the Phillipses. I'm going to talk just a bit about him here. Phillips himself was a native of Friesland, one of the islands sort of on the northeastern shore of Holland. And he emigrated to New Amsterdam in 1647. His skills were in carpentry and construction and engineering, which are all very good skills to have when you are entering a town that's just getting started. By 1658, about 11 years after he arrives, Phillips had acquired this prime piece of property across from the fort. He built a rather nice-looking structure, as we can see from this image, and later, Brower Street was renamed Stone Street, right around the time that he gets this house, and becomes the first paved street, actually, in New Amsterdam. Soon after building this house, Frederick Phillips married a very wealthy young widow named Margaret Hardenbrock de Vries, and with his new family, which included about 6, maybe 7 children by 1670, Phillips purchased the lot next door to him and built a much larger house on the property. By 1674, the Phillipses were listed on tax records as the wealthiest family in the city. Now, no images of their new house exist, but various members of the Phillips family lived in this house on the corner of Stone and Whitehall Street for almost 125 years. They left because they were forced to leave at the end of the American Revolution. Phillips, as you see, were loyal to England. So today, what do we have to commemorate the 125-year residence of the wealthiest family in colonial New York? Chipotle. Actually, it's a modern 32-story high-rise built on the property, the area where the Phillipses had their property. It was built in 1959. It's actually a pretty cool-looking building. But the fast food restaurant takes part of the ground floor where the Phillips family's house stood. To our left here is the group of Phillips Manor Hall staff who wanted to commemorate the Phillipses' house by standing in front of the Chipotle. But maybe it's all right that we have a Chipotle to honor the Phillipses. I mean, times are changing, right? Perhaps we just don't need to commemorate a family simply because they're rich or famous or... Okay, I got myself corrected here. Thank you, Kardashians. We still celebrate families for just being rich or famous. New York City is not a city that looks backwards. It is a city that is always moving forward. But sometimes you can get lucky. Just a couple of blocks from the Phillips Chipotle is a place where some accidental evidence of another Phillips residence was found. So in colonial New York, just like today, the walk from the Phillips's residence at Stone and Whitehall to his house at Pearl and Coenties Slip takes about, 4 or 5 minutes. The wide street to cross here is Broad Street. 1 block down from Stone Street is Bridge Street. And I don't know if you ever wondered why it's named Bridge Street, or you ever wonder why Broadway or Broad Street's so broad. Whether you wonder or not, I'm going to tell you. Because Broad Street was called the Air Graft, and it was a canal, basically. As you can see from the map, there is actually a canal and a series of bridges across that canal. This is a 19th century illustration of the graft. The creek was dug out to make a canal, and to cross over this ditch, a series of bridges were constructed. 1 at Beaver Street, 1 on Stone Street, and 1 at Bridge Street. Now, I don't think that the canal was nearly as picturesque as this 19th century illustration suggests, because from what I understand, mostly the canal was used as a dump, and by the 1680s it was already filled in. Now we're stopping at the Pearl Street side of 85 Broad Street, where we can find some archaeological evidence of a Phillips family dwelling. Now, as you can see here, this high-rise, it just dwarfs the 19th century buildings in front of it. This is 85 Broad Street. And in the fall of 1979, I should say, an archaeological excavation of the block around 85 Broad Street began. Now, the New York Times, and I'm going to quote them here, did an article about sort of this excavation that went on. They said, a new building was about to go up, whose foundation would destroy whatever remained of the buried history of the block. So after consulting maps and documents, they concluded that the site, located in the oldest part of the city, had more than 300 years of secrets to divulge, including a patchwork of foundation walls and more than 4 tons of artifacts. Those artifacts included some of the stone and brick foundations for the Stadthaus. Now, the Stadthaus was a tavern used as city hall when this was under Dutch rule. And right next to the Stadthaus, there was another foundation that they excavated, and it was the foundation of the very first city hall under English rule, which was also a tavern. The sidewalk around the southeast side of 85 Broad Street has a number of cutouts in it today, archaeological excavation sites that are now covered in plexiglass that show the original timber, the bricks, the stone, the foundation, basically, of these 17th century buildings. You can walk there today, and it's like you're walking on top of the past. It's pretty cool. And next to all of this is a round excavation site, also covered in plexi, that you can look at. And this was a freshwater well or a cistern, likely on the property of the Phillips family. The plaque here reads, I'm just going to read it. It says, this well dates to the early 1700s. I'm just reading it, not this one, but another one that is next to it. It was located on property which belonged to the Phillips family. The well originally extended down to the water table, providing water for the inhabitants of the block. It is lined with arc-shaped bricks. So aside from the layout of the streets, these plexi-encased archaeological sites at 85 Broad Street represent some of the only in situ evidence of colonial-era New Amsterdam and New York. And anybody can take a look at it. It's pretty neat. Now here's an image of New Amsterdam sketched, as we had seen before, in or around 1650, before the Costello map was even made. And you can see here, there weren't even any streets, just dirt paths between the ramshackle houses. Pearl Street was basically just the shoreline here of the East River. So we're going to take our armchair Wayback Machine and we're going to glide across the East River shoreline. And we're going to head down to this little spit of land just south of the fort. It's hard to imagine how small and ramshackle this Dutch outpost was, but by 1641 there weren't more than 250 people here who called New Amsterdam home. Today, if we head down this way, we'd be at the corner of Whitehall Street and State Street. Below us would be the terminus for the Staten Island Ferry. Now, all that's on landfill. This area was used to unload goods for cargo ships. It was also a public space for punishment. This little small rectangle that you see in the center with the circle around it is a gallows. And you can actually see that corresponding to it on this map says the place of execution. Now, here's a more cleaned up version of it. But in late January 1641, Manuel Gerrit de Royce van Angola stood at this gallows, awaiting his death. The executioner placed 2 nooses around his neck, just in case, and pulled out the small ladder from underneath de Royce. So who was de Royce, and why was he sentenced to hang? Well, de Royce was one of 11 captive Africans who was taken to New Amsterdam in 1626-27. Dutch sailors had captured a Portuguese ship and brought the vessel's human cargo to New Amsterdam, where they were put to work by the Dutch West India Company, building roads, constructing the fort, clearing fields, and trenching the canal. 14 years after de Royce's arrival, he and the other 10 men were still toiling for the Dutch West India Company. Now, they may not have legally been defined as slaves, because there was really no law yet defining enslavement in New Netherland. But they were serving some form of permanent indentureship, because traditionally an indentured servant contract lasted 5, 6, or 7 years. So 14 years and counting for de Royce and the other African captives was definitely not typical. Now, according to court records, in January 1641, 9 of the African captives were arrested and charged with the murder of another African man, a man named Jan Primero. All 9 pled guilty to the charge. Now, they were questioned in court, but the men would never or not divulge why they had beaten Primero to death. But rather than sentence all 9 men to hang for that murder, which would really, no doubt, reduce the labor population of the town significantly, the council decided that the men were to draw lots to determine who should be held responsible for Primero's death. And Manuel Gerrit de Royce drew the short straw, and he was sentenced to hang. So what happened after the executioner pulled out the ladder? Well, according to the council minutes, the rope broke. In fact, both ropes broke, which led townfolk to call for mercy on de Royce's half. De Royce survives his execution, and de Royce's life was spared by the council. 3 years later, in 1644, Manuel Gerrit de Royce van Angola was one of the original 11 African captives to receive what has come to be known as half-freedom. He was granted about 10, almost 11 acres of land far outside the town limits, in the area where New York University and Washington Square is today. It was called half-freedom for a reason. You see, although freedom was granted to these men and to their spouses, their children and any children that they would have were to remain enslaved to the Dutch West India Company. New Netherland never ended slavery in the Dutch colony. When the English took control in 1664, they not only increased their reliance on enslaved labor, they passed laws making it illegal for free persons of color to own land in the colony. So enslavement here in New York was as deeply ingrained as it was in Virginia or in the Carolinas. We don't see much evidence of it in Manhattan because, well, this is a city always reinventing itself, moving forward. But if you know where to look and what to read, you can get a lot of just out of walking around. Now, for example, I always have an example. Taking our couch scooter along the East River, we're headed to the edge of town, way, way up to Wall Street, where, yes, there was a wall, sort of a palisades fence built around by men like Manuel Gerrit de Royce in 1653. We're standing now at the intersection of Wall and Water Street. By the early 1700s, the wall was gone. Town limits had extended well beyond what is today's Fulton Street, what had been then called Fair Street. And landfill had pushed New York City's eastern shore from Pearl to Water Street. So here in 1711, town leaders decided that New York needed a central location for the sale and the renting of its ever-increasing enslaved population. This was the site of New York's first slave market. By 1711, New York City's population hovered around 5,800 people, which included close to 1,100 who were enslaved, almost double the number from just 10 years earlier. As the enslaved population of New York increased, a central market became necessary to carry out the business of human trafficking. African captives arriving by ship would be purchased here, Enslaved dock workers or skilled coopers or laundresses would come here to be rented by their enslaver to somebody else who might needed day work and such performed. Now there's a sign at the corner of Wall and Water Street marking the site of the slave market. It was placed here in 2015, and unfortunately the sign is terribly small and placed in a location that is both difficult to see and to read. So the sign itself, I think, is a sign of how deeply New York City struggles with its relationship with enslavement. Now we're going to move a couple of blocks away now. We're heading out to Maiden Lane. Prior to 1700, Maiden Lane was originally a small stream that meandered from Broadway down to the East River. The street today still arcs from Broadway following the path of the old stream. It's really pretty, actually, when you can kind of take a good look at how those buildings kind of arc to follow the street. The Dutch referred to the valley made by the stream as the Vlei, or Fly. The Dutch called it VLY. It's pronounced kind of fly. After the stream was filled in, English merchants, they built warehouses along the banks, and a produce market was established. The Dutch word for valley, being Vlei or fly, is actually another term for the fly market that was established here on Maiden Lane. Maiden Lane was also the site of the city's first slave rebellion. See, on the evening of April 6th, 1712, just less than a year after city leaders erected the slave market there at the corner of Wall and Market and Water Street, a small group of enslaved Africans, most of whom were recent arrivals from the Coromantine region of what is now Ghana and Benin, they set fire to a home on Maiden Lane. As white residents came to put out the flames, they were attacked by their African captives. Now, the Coromantee Africans had thought that other members of the enslaved community would join in this insurrection, setting fire to their enslavers' residences and killing them. But that wasn't the case. 9 white residents were killed in this uprising. Many of the African men fled. Some actually committed suicide rather than be caught. The remainder, along with numerous other enslaved men and women, were arrested and held in jail. 47 enslaved men and women were hastily tried, and 20 were brutally tortured and executed for attempting to rebel against their enslavers. Now, this was a message being sent to the enslaved community that punishment for acting in any sort of the way rebellious would be met not only with death, but with pain and torture as well. Now, if Gallup or Marist did polling in the colonial days, I think fear of a slave insurrection just might have topped the list for white colonists. And that's because there's just plenty of evidence showing that enslaved communities regularly resisted their forced captivity. Being legally classified as property removed any protection of a person's human rights. People were being bought and sold. Families were being separated. Women were being raped. It made perfect sense to rebel against these horrific conditions for the enslaved community. And now keep in mind also that every colony in the New World, from Canada to Chile, and this included every one of the 13 English colonies, had some form of legalized system of enslavement. Throughout most of the 18th century, New York City's enslaved population hovered around 20%. That's 1 person in 5. Only Charleston, South Carolina had a larger enslaved population, urban slave population anyway. New York was a city that was densely populated. The city itself, at this point, town limits made the town no more than 1/3 of a square mile in area, and there were 11,000 residents, 2,200 of whom were enslaved by 1740. Now, sometimes resistance would take a more covert or individual approach, like breaking tools, feigning illness, pacing one's productivity. All makes sense. But other times, more overt acts were used. Acts like self-emancipation or fighting back in the face of punishment to oneself or one's family, or outright plots to insurrect. Colonial newspapers of the day were full of reports about insurrections, conspiracies, all throughout the Caribbean, on board slave ships headed for the colonies, and in North American cities and countrysides. From Boston to Barbados, enslaved individuals and families and groups plotted and organized against their enslavers, and New York was simply no exception to that. We're going to leave Maiden Lane now, arguably one of the city's most infamous streets, for Manhattan, one of Manhattan's anyway, most famous streets. So we're going to head south now on William Street, hang a right, and get back onto Wall Street. Today, the intersection of Wall and Broad Street marks the epicenter of American finance. And we've got the New York Stock Exchange sitting on the corner, and there are more power suits and Ferraris here probably than anywhere else on the planet. This was also the site where President Washington took his oath of office. This is why there's a statue of George Washington right in front of Federal Hall. Now, the current Federal Hall, this Greek Revival building, wasn't built until 1842, so it, in fact, has nothing to do with any of this. But the building that stood there before the current Federal Hall, and it stood there throughout the entire 1700s, was New York City Hall. And it was a much better building, I think, than the two taverns that had served as the previous locations for colonial government in the 1600s. The Phillips family were politically active in New York, and they spent a great deal of time here at City Hall. Between 1722 and 1745, Adolph Phillips served as Speaker of the Assembly, at least for 18 of the 23 years that he was an elected official. And Adolph's nephew, Frederick Phillips II, was appointed as the second Justice of New York's Supreme Court in 1731. Supreme Court also held session here at New York City Hall. He held that position for 20 years until his death in 1751. And all told, between 1722 and all the way to 1777, 55 years, there was a Phillips family member in the New York Assembly and in this building. For 55 years, the Phillipses were at least hanging around this building. Now, although the Phillipses' family estate was located 17 miles north at Phillips Manor Hall in Yonkers, their commute to work was only a few minutes. See, according to the wills of Frederick I and Frederick II, the family owned 2 or 3 large warehouses on New Street and at least 11 homes in the city. Now, 5 or 6 of those homes they were using for themselves and their growing family, and then they rented, it seems, the remaining units. Now, I've circled New Street here because New Street did not exist under Dutch rule. It wasn't even seen on the 1660 Castello-Cortelyou map. In 1695, Reverend John Miller drew this map, the one that was the first to actually show New Street. Now, it's named New Street because it was the first new street made after the English took control in 1664. The Phillips family took advantage of this new real estate, purchasing several lots for warehouses and residences. Now, today, New Street, this is an idea of where those buildings are. I don't think anyone has really figured out exactly where all of Phillips's properties were. We just know that he had a bunch of them in this fairly small town. If you want to see New Street today, there's not much to see. It's really just an alleyway between Broadway and Broad Streets. But because of this, it's really one of the most overlooked places in Lower Manhattan. So overlooked, in fact, the only picture I could find of New Street, aside from this Google Street View on the right, the left side, dates to the blizzard of 1888. It's not an easy street to find pictures of because there's really not much going on there. But I do think it's worth a little short ride off of Manhattan now to view another noteworthy Phillips property. Bedloe's Island was named after Isaac Bedloe, who in 1667 purchased what had been known as Minaseus by the Munsee Lenape. It's a small island. Bedloe's Island remained in the Bedloe family until 1732, when Adolph Phillips and a fellow merchant named Henry Lane bought the island. Now, neither had time to really develop this island because really shortly thereafter the city took it over or rented it for use as a quarantine station to inspect ships for smallpox. Phillips, however, kept ownership of the island until 1746, selling it to a guy named Archibald Kennedy. Now, today, Bedloe's Island has been renamed Liberty Island for obvious reasons. Ironic, though, that the loyalist Phillips family owned for a time this harbor island where Lady Liberty now stands. All right, let's zip back across the harbor to Manhattan. We're headed to the next northern fringes of colonial New York. Not Wall Street or Maiden Lane this time, but by the 1740s, New York City had been expanding its city limits, pushing farther north. We've just landed north of Chambers Street, on the east side of Broadway. And now, by 1740, Chambers Street pretty much marked the city limits of New York City. This 1755 map shows our exact location. So let me zoom in on that oval a little bit. Now let me turn it around so you don't have to read sideways. Long before this 1755 map was drawn, this area east of Broadway was known as the Negroes' Burial Ground. See, it wasn't actually discovered in 1991 when the area was being excavated for a government services building. So it had been clearly marked on maps for almost 250 years. The burial ground existed from the 1690s to the 1790s. Historians and archaeologists estimate that this 6.5-acre site served as the final resting place for more than 15,000 enslaved and free persons of color. You see, slaves were not allowed to be buried in the consecrated cemeteries at Trinity or St. Paul's or the Dutch Reformed Church or the Old Synagogue. At other downtown cemeteries, skeletal remains were often excavated and then reinterred farther uptown as the city grew. But not so with the burial ground. The city just built over the land, digging up bodies and skeletons as basements and sewers and subways were put in. Now, if you're ever in the area of the African burial ground, I urge you to stop by the memorial and say a few words of remembrance for the 419 men, women, and children who have been reinterred at this site. It's a very powerful place. And you may never know when you may be nearby, because less than 100 yards to the east of the burial ground is Foley Square. And what's so famous about Foley Square? Well, it's Manhattan's center for law and order, so to speak. Chung chung. That's not really why we're here, though. Foley Square, as we know it, is only about 100 years old. In the 1800s, this neighborhood was a slum called the Five Points. The buildings were wood-framed, 2 or 3 stories high, with dark alleys in the back. Crime was rampant and very organized. Gang violence was a daily occurrence. Gaming houses, brothels, cheap restaurants, and basement taverns, they catered to the Irish immigrants and the African Americans who were forced to live under these terrible conditions in this neighborhood. But that's also not why we're really here. Because before there was a Five Points, this area was outside of New York City's limits. And as you can see here to the right, the Five Points neighborhood, and later Foley Square, was actually built over a freshwater pond known as the Collect. Now, the Collect had been drained in the early 1800s, allowing for the streets to be paved over it. But the Collect in the 1700s was the largest nearby body of fresh water for residents of New York. Now, it was chalky, apparently, and swampy in flavor. It wasn't the best tasting water at all, but it did serve its purpose. And it also served the enslaved community as a gathering space to share news, meet with separated loved ones or family members. And although the city laws limited the number of enslaved individuals who were allowed to gather in one place, it was difficult to enforce those laws at the only freshwater site within walking distance. The location of the freshwater pond, next to the enslaved burial ground, also made it a choice place as an execution site. Look closely at this map, and you can see that the cartographer placed a gallows and a bonfire on the map. The brutal nature of a public execution was meant to send a strong message of deterrence to members of the enslaved community, who may have had thoughts of an insurrection or acts of violence against their enslavers. And there were several organized conspiracies carried out against their oppressors. We already stopped at Maiden Lane, and we heard about the rebellion of 1712. Several men and women executed for their perceived role in that plot took place here. And 29 years later, in the spring of 1741, a series of highly suspicious fires, coupled with rumors of a Spanish invasion, led New Yorkers to believe there was another full-blown slave conspiracy afoot. Like the 1712 uprising, the aim of the conspirators was to burn down the town, kill white residents as they came to extinguish the flames. In the early morning hours of Wednesday, the 18th of March, 1741, Fort George, the governor's headquarters, began to burn. Fire was always a cause for alarm, and New York City is a city made out of wood. By daybreak, the mansion of Lieutenant Governor George Clark, the fort's chapel, several other buildings within the fort were reduced to ashes. The next Wednesday, the 25th of March, another fire broke out, the house of Captain Robert Warren near the Long Bridge. A bucket brigade saved the house from being destroyed. A week later, on Wednesday, April 1st, fire destroys the warehouse of Winnet Van Zandt. That's 3 fires on 3 successive Wednesdays. People are wondering what's up. Then the real trouble begins. Saturday, April the 4th, fire at the cow stables of Jacobus Quick near the Fly Market on the corner of Maiden Lane and Pearl Street. A few hours later, another fire nearby at the house of Ben Thomas. And early on the morning of April the 5th, coals were discovered under a haystack in the stables of the city's clerk, Mr. Joseph Murray. A string of ashes and coals were traced to the stables to a nearby outbuilding where one of Murray's slaves lived. Now, Monday, April the 6th, the same day as the 1712 insurrection, there were 4 more fires. Fire at the house of Sergeant George Burns near the fort. And another fire discovered at Mrs. Hilton's house, again near the Fly Market on Maiden Lane, the same street where the 1712 rebellion occurred. Early that afternoon, another fire was reported. This one was at Frederick Phillips's warehouse on New Street. And then there was a 4th fire that broke out. One of the firefighters who remained at Phillips's warehouse saw an enslaved man named Cuffy leap out of the smoldering warehouse, hopping over several garden fences. It was said that Justice Phillips could see smoke billowing from his New Street warehouse from the courthouse window on the afternoon of April the 6th, 1741. Authorities arrested Cuffy shortly after at the home of his enslaver near Pearl Street and Broad Street. 9 fires in 18 days. So this did not seem like just a coincidence or bad luck. Town residents were certain that another insurrection was imminent. Over 200 enslaved men and women were rounded up and placed in jail. They were questioned and tried for arson and conspiracy to insurrect. Over 70 enslaved men were deported from the colony to Sugar Islands and Barbados and Antigua. Another 18 were hanged, and 13 more were burned at the stake for their involvement in this alleged plot. Now, unlike the 1712 incident where 9 whites were killed in the aborted insurrection, no whites were killed trying to put out the flames in this one. So it seems like conspiracy, simply talking about insurrection, was enough to get you executed in 1741. Now, who sentenced Cuffy, the enslaved man accused of setting fire to Frederick Phillips's warehouse on New Street? Well, that would be New York Supreme Court Justice Frederick Phillips. It was also the same Frederick Phillips who pronounced Cuffy sentenced to be chained to a stake and burnt to death. Who was Cuffy's enslaver? Well, that would be Frederick Phillips's uncle, Adolph Phillips. We already saw the archaeological remnants of his cistern near Pearl and Broad Street. This is probably the location where Cuffy ran after he was seen leaving the burning warehouse on New Street. So the Phillipses and members of their enslaved community have their fingerprints all over this tragic story of 1741. Now we're going to go back to where we started now, the fort, because a co-conspirator of Cuffy's, an enslaved man named Quack, most likely his name was Quaco, which was an Akan, African Akan day name, which like Cuffy, whose day name was most likely Kofi. So there was quite an African presence in the 1741 conspiracy, similar to that of 1712. Now, Quack was accused of setting fire to Fort George here. The fort's walls, they were no more than 30 yards from Frederick Phillips's house on the corner of Stone and Whitehall here. So if Phillips was in the city that night, he would have watched in horror as flames rose high above the fort's walls. And his fears, like that of all New York residents, were that errant sparks would blow out from the burning fort, igniting the rooftops of the city. Only a freezing drizzle kind of saved New York that night, leaving the Phillips family residences apparently undamaged. Now, you can read a lot more about the 1741 conspiracy from court transcripts prepared by the third court justice, a man named Daniel Horsemanton. Or you can also look at Jill Lepore's award-winning book, New York Burning. This will get into a lot more detail than I can about the 1741 insurrection. Now, at the north side of Fort George was the main gate. During the fire, Governor George Clark evacuated his residents inside the fort, and he ordered his militia, who had barracks inside the fort, to disperse into the city streets, keeping order and putting out any fires that may have started. The soldiers would have gathered at the Bowling Green, just as you see in this image, this oval, where these soldiers are marching around. This is where Broadway begins. Originally, it's a Lenape trail. The Broadway runs through the entire island of Manhattan, crosses the Harlem River, and continues on through the Bronx and Westchester, and then as the Albany Post Road, all the way up to the Capitol. The Bowling Green was New York's first city-owned park. Still there today. It's a small wedge-shaped property, occupying the same location since its inception in 1733. You may have visited it. This is the park where there is a rather large sculpture of a charging bull, a nod to the nearby financial district of Wall Street. But originally, the area in front of the fort was used as a meat market for purchasing livestock. But by the middle of the 1600s, it had become a parade grounds. And in March of 1733, the New York City Common Council passed a resolution to lease the land at the lower end of Broadway to private citizens for the creation of the city's first public park. The Common Council records of 1733 reads here, it says, resolved that this corporation will lease a piece of ground lying at the lower end of Broadway fronting the fort to make a bowling green thereof, with walks therein for the beauty and ornament of said street. A year and a half later, the council added something. In October 1734, it says, resolved that the bowling green, as it is now in fence, be leased unto Frederick Phillips, Esquire, Mr. John Chambers, and Mr. John Roosevelt for the term of 10 years. So Frederick Phillips II here, one of the wealthiest men in the colony, was a partner in the creation and upkeep of the Bowling Green. So what's a bowling green? Well, it's just what it says it is. It's an area of flat, grass-covered land that's very good for playing games like bocce, lawn bowling. Basically, it is a bowling green, literally. But over the centuries, the park discontinued its original use as a place for lawn bowling, and even by the 1840s, there was a fountain there already, ringed by benches and landscaped with trees and other greenery, which had become the park's central focus. It really wasn't until 1989 that the Charging Bull was relocated to Bowling Green. There was, however, some commotion at the Bowling Green during the American Revolution. You see, in 1770, a statue of King George III was installed in the park, and it was open to the public. In 1770, Lieutenant Governor Cadwallader Colden recalled an event, this particular event, in a letter to the Earl of Hillsborough. Colden writes, an equestrian statue of the king came over in one of the last ships from London. On Thursday last, it was open to view, erected on its proper pedestal, in a square near the fort and fronting the principal street of the city. Our loyalty, firm attachment, and affection to His Majesty's person was expressed by drinking the king's health and a long continuance of his reign, under a discharge of 32 pieces of cannon, a band of music playing at the same time from the ramparts of the fort. Huzzah! Toasting the king's health. Good times, right? Well, I guess it doesn't last too long, because just 6 years later, on July 9th, 1776, the newly passed Declaration of Independence was read to the soldiers stationed in New York. The announcement was like a fuse to a tinderbox. In the New York City Common Council, the chambers, actually, the royal coat of arms and a portrait of King George III were tossed to the ground. And then a mob of soldiers and sailors and Sons of Liberty and other townsfolk filled the Bowling Green, climbed the statue of King George, threw ropes around it, and toppled it off its pedestal. So, huzzah, or gasp, depending upon your side that you take at the war. The toppling of King George's statue may have been the last act, actually, of patriotic fervor in New York, at least in New York City, for the duration of the war, because the British were convinced that controlling New York City and the Hudson River were key to dividing the colonies and containing the American rebels. Within weeks after the statue was torn down, His Majesty's forces had landed on Staten Island, pushed through Brooklyn and Queens, and taken Manhattan, a region that the British would not relinquish until the very end of the war. By mid-September of 1776, the British were in control of southern Westchester and Long Island as well. And a week later, the end of September 1776, a devastating fire broke out in lower Manhattan. The fire consumed about 25% of the city, burning a long strip along the Hudson River and everything around the fort. Now, according to this map, the fire may have been particularly damaging to the Phillips family. Now, no records exist indicating what or how much Phillips-owned property was destroyed in the September 76 blaze, but their primary residence at Whitehall and Stone Street, the little circle, as well as their houses and warehouses on New Street, that longer oval, were right in the middle of the fire's path. As loyalists, the Phillips family found themselves living in lower Manhattan really for most of the war. Now, they must have owned additional property in town that wasn't burnt down in the Great Fire of 76, or they ended up renting from friends places to live. But eventually, I guess, the war ended. Does anybody know who won? Well, with the British defeat, now you know, His Majesty's troops and others remaining loyal to the crown were to evacuate the city. For many years, residents of New York celebrated what became known as Evacuation Day, November the 25th. That was the day that the last British troops left Manhattan. On the northern end of Bowling Green, very close to the Bull actually, is a street sign commemorating the date that George Washington heroically re-entered New York City in 1783. Who else was evacuated with the British Army in 1783? Well, yes, the loyalist Phillips family left for New York, bound for England, actually. But so did thousands of formerly enslaved men, women, and children. In 1779, the British enacted the Phillipsburg Proclamation, offering freedom to all individuals enslaved by rebels, the Patriots, who could find their way to British-held territory. The British weren't abolitionists now, they too were enslavers, but they knew how to disrupt the economy of Americans who relied on slave labor. At the end of the war, the British actually kept their promise to free those who ran behind British lines. Americans, including George Washington, were outraged that the losers of the war would confiscate the so-called private property of Americans. But by November 25th, 1783, some 3,500 ex-slaves left New York Harbor with the British to be resettled in Nova Scotia and other British colonies, and as many as 15,000 former slaves left with the British from other American ports at the end of the war. That, too, was part of Evacuation Day, and it should be remembered that, in this case, freedom and independence meant siding with the British. Now, this kind of wraps up our Time Traveler's Guide to Colonial Manhattan. All in all, if you don't count our flyover to Bedloe Liberty Island there, we covered about 2.7 miles, starting and ending in front of the site of the old fort, today's Customs House, the Museum of the Native American. You too can walk this path. You don't need to necessarily just sort of watch it from the comfort of your own home, but pick a good day and head on out to Lower Manhattan and take a walk around. See, Manhattan has plenty of history, much more than I could cover in this little presentation. Every day, thousands of people walk the streets of Lower Manhattan without a clue about what was here or what happened on the very ground that they walk. But now, as I said, you can do what I've been doing for years, dragging my kids and my students, co-workers, and significant other through these narrow and winding streets, sharing the same space and walking in the same footsteps of people who lived here centuries ago. Just remember, if you do choose to walk around the streets of downtown New York, modern Manhattan is going to fight for your attention and try to keep you from being immersed in its history. Do your best to stay focused. Enjoy yourself out there. Plenty of good restaurants. Head on out to Stone Street. Walk the walk. Enjoy this beautiful sort of understanding of American history as you go out there. Now, thank you I hope we have some time to take some questions. I believe that we have a little bit of time here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my best to exit this screen, go back to seeing who I am, and seeing if we can get back to doing what we need to do here. Now, looks like I'm such a Luddite when it comes to this. First of all, I apologize for whatever happened at the beginning. I'm glad that John's here to help me out. Now, let's take a look at a couple of questions that we might have here. I have a question from, let's see, where were we at? Oh, I have a point to put out there. Mr. Wong says that King George III statue, the one that was torn down, was melted down to make musket bowls, and it was done in Litchfield, Connecticut. And the tail of the horse could actually be viewed at the New York Historical Society. So that's pretty interesting. I kind of like that idea of seeing the tail of the horse at the New York Historical Society. Anything else up here? We have a question. Yeah. All right. Mm-hmm. I know a couple things about the Delanceys during my research on the 1741 insurrection, because I believe it was James Delancey was the Supreme Court Chief Justice. Now, he was not presiding over the 1741 insurrection because he was actually in Rhode Island most of that time, negotiating some kind of a land boundary thing that was going on between New England. But Delancey was a presiding justice. One of his enslaved men, named Othello, was implicated in the 1741 insurrection. And by the time that Delancey, I believe, got back to New York, he had found a way to keep Othello from getting executed. And Delancey had been the Supreme Court justice for a number of years. So him and Phillips had known each other for quite a while. Delancey's house, I believe, was on Queen Street, which at that time was what Pearl Street was renamed to. So he may have been close by to Adolph Phillips's house as well. The later Delanceys were staunch loyalists as well, like the Phillipses. A lot of the wealthy families during the American Revolution, like the Van Cortlands and the Livingstons and the Squylers and such, they ended up siding with the rebels, the patriotic side. But the Delanceys and the Phillipses both remained staunchly loyal to the crown. And suffered for it because they lost their property, they lost all of their houses, they lost all of their land at the end of the war. It was all confiscated, and it was sold off to all sorts of different individuals in smaller chunks. So that's what I know of the Delanceys. I know that there's more information about their role in the American Revolution, and I believe we are going to be adding a couple of more blog posts, certainly coming up in the next this year and probably next year as well, where we're going to dig into some more details about that as well. So thank you, Franklin. I probably answered only a piece of your question, but I'd be happy to talk to you some more as well about that. Hey. Terrific. Oh, I see Karen posted here from the Morris Jamel Mansion, the former home of Mary Phillips Morris, who was, yes, the Phillips related. She was the sister of Frederick Phillips III. Yeah, Roger Morris was a colonel in the British troops. They were friends of the Delanceys, as I see here. Roger mentions them in his letters, so you can also, Franklin, possibly get in touch with the Morris Jamel Mansion and try to also find the letters that are between Morris and Delancey as well. Mary Phillips Morris married, when did she marry? 1758 or 59, I believe. And then they built the mansion there on the northern fringes of Manhattan in the 1760s, I guess in the mid 60s. I'm not one to talk. Karen could be the one that can give me a lot better information, but she can certainly fill you in on any information about the relationship between the Delanceys and the Morrises as well. Well, folks, we have recorded this session. So if you know anybody else who might benefit from listening in, we will have this put up on our YouTube page as soon as we can get the closed captioning straightened out. It shouldn't be too difficult. And we'll have this, and we have a number of other presentations from our lecture series that have been going on for more than a year now. Also posted to our YouTube page. So take a look at that. John has added a link to Mr. Minty's lecture on the YouTube channel. So you can always take a look at all of the different presentations that we have to offer. I want to thank you for your attendance here. It was wonderful chatting with everybody. If you have more questions, you can always get in touch with us. You know where we live. We are at Phillips Manor Hall, 29 Warburton Avenue in Yonkers. You can always get in touch with us. Thank you so much, folks, for coming. Enjoy the rest of your night.